Um, all right, so that's just a small thing. All right. So, like I said, because there are only 3 people remaining, I don't mind if you do it all as one team or whether you do it as 2 teams. Okay. But don't do it in 3. Now, I want to, now I haven't had a chance to prepare a lot of slides because this was actually, some of this was from last night. And from experience and just listening carefully to some of the questions that were raised in class, I kind of get an idea of where there might be confusion with some of you guys, and I'm going to try to clarify on these points. Now, first of all, regarding trading total return swaps, now this is, if you want, I don't like to call it a normal answer, but that's what Ryan was looking for when he was asking, what was the question? The question was, what do you need to do in order to make sure that your total return swap does not get requalified as a repo? Now, do you understand that question? Yeah? The whole discussion about total return swaps versus repo, it comes from a very simple but very important distinction, which is that when you are doing a repo, it actually, the transaction stays on your balance sheet, whereas when you are doing a TRS, it's off balance sheet. Now, that is the most important distinction that I can think of. And all kinds of consequences flow from there. When something is on the balance sheet, now, and you know how Ryan is very fond of talking about the legal angle, and then there's the accounting angle, and he's always saying the economics. What does that mean, the economics? Economics basically just means the risk and the return, in my mind. Okay, so when he says the economics are the same, it means the risk and returns are similar. But legally and accounting-wise, things can be very different. So the economics of doing a repo, or I should say the risk and returns of doing a repo and the risk and returns of doing a TRS are similar. They are not the same. They are not the same precisely because of the regulatory treatment. I think that's the way to kind of think of it. Yes? The first part of your statement is correct. TRS is off balance sheet, but whether you are hedging or not is an entirely separate issue. You may well be hedging, you may not. Yes, you can just do a TRS on one side. And it's not just TRS, okay? It's any derivative that a bank is doing. Okay, so I'm JP Morgan. It is entirely my freedom, if I wish to do a derivative with, company XYZ, and I just let it hang out there. I don't have to hedge it. I might want to, but I don't have to hedge it. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, less, much less. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll show you in a moment. You are several steps ahead. I will show you that. Okay. So, for example, So when you are doing a repo, well, what exactly does that mean? So if you are bank A and there's a bond that you really want to invest in, so this is the bond market, and you want to buy this bond, doesn't matter what bond it is, okay, bond X. So you buy this bond, but guess what? You don't have money to pay for it. Now, there are several ways you can do it. Now, the classical way, the really old-fashioned way, of course, is just to go to the money market. You borrow $100, you pay that away, and the bond is yours. And then you just keep paying, LIBOR, you keep funding it every 3 months, let's say. So every quarter you are refunding it until the end. Now, banks do that a lot. Now, that's the classical old-fashioned way of doing things. And I hope you all understand that part, right? Now, the second way, and of course, this is actually, you are leveraging. Anytime you are borrowing money to do something where you are getting somebody else's cash, you are leveraging. Now, the second way, so this is kind of like the old-fashioned way. The second way is, so you are the bank, and you really like this bond, so this part doesn't change. So bond X, and you still have to pay the money, so that doesn't change to the bond market. But this time, you don't go to the money market. You go to somebody else, maybe Bank B, or it could be a fund manager. And you say to them, hey, how about I sell you this bond X, and then you pay me 100. Now, it won't be exactly 100 because there are haircuts and stuff like that, but ignoring those details. So here you are selling, and I put sell in inverted commas because you're not really selling, because at the start, this is what you do, but it's really the end part that is the most crucial. The repo, which stands for repurchase agreement, you agree to buy it back at a future date, and it is actually the future obligation to buy it back, which is a contractual obligation. That is the part that captures all the risk, not bond X. Are you with me? So such a simple idea, because you promise to buy something back. That promise is almost as if you've committed yourself to a futures contract. So you are buying, so you buy back. But unfortunately, when you do it the second way, so you are retaining all the economics. So you get the risks and you get the benefits, but it also stays on your balance sheet. It stays on your balance sheet. So repo is on balance sheet. Now, here's the point. So after they invented credit derivative, there is now a third way to do this. And the third way is exactly Bank A and Bank B and Bank A is still kind of normally just paying LIBOR, and then Bank B will actually provide the well, I guess the total return of bond X. Now, finance actually sometimes is surprisingly simple. So do not think that these things are complicated, they're not. And the whole idea is whatever you end up doing, method 1, method 2, method 3, like I've said 5,000 times, the economics are similar. It's the legal and the regulatory that are different. I don't know, you had a question? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Where? Ah, right, thank you. Yeah. Can't even tell the difference between A and B. Okay, so method, thank you. So method C, total return swap, is off balance sheet. Now, because it is off balance sheet, that means you don't need as much capital to back up that transaction. And I'm going to show you in a moment what we mean by that. You don't need as much capital. So once bankers realize, oh, you can actually do it like that. So let's, instead of doing repos, let's just try and do TRS as much as we could. And they did. Of course, they are different markets. So the bonds are different between the repo market, which is a lot bigger, a lot more liquid and a lot deeper. And the bonds are different. So you can't do everything. You can't just migrate everything you wish to do in the repo market to TRS, but to some degree you can, and they did. And like Warren was saying, the regulators are not stupid. Okay? You might think they are, but they're not. So they know what's going on. So therefore, the idea is, if you are in a bank and you are kind of trying to do this trick, try not to make it so obvious. Okay? When you are doing a TRS, make it look like you really are doing a TRS and not a repo transaction in disguise. That's the whole point. Which leads me to the quiz question last night. What's the point of asking that? Well, you want to avoid doing these things because they make it look like you are doing a repo or a physical transaction. Make a derivative look like a derivative. You get what I'm saying? Yeah? If you do, you are really getting it now. Okay. I actually asked him, I said, okay, so who actually has authority to requalify, or I guess reclassify might be a better word. Okay, reclassify a TRS into a repo. Who does? Huh? I asked him that question last night, and the regulator certainly can, but he said actually within the bank, okay, before the regulators even come, the internal auditors, when they look at this trade, they will shoot you down. They say, hey, look, I am really worried that when the regulator comes, they're going to look at this and they're going to have questions because your so-called TRS has a physical settlement, and your TRS involves you buying or selling a physical bond with the person that you are trading. So I'm not going to call this TRS a TRS. What are you going to call it? I'm going to call it a repo. Okay, that's what he meant. Is everyone okay on that? Yeah. So that's kind of the mindset. Okay. Now, I was very grateful to see the presentation yesterday regarding the Bloomberg Index on Chinese fixed income. And I want to thank suggestion for sharing it, because it made me think quite hard about this issue, and it made me think about things that I want to share with you. Something that was not mentioned last night, which I think I can share with you here. Now the Chinese bond market is huge, which is a good thing. So you have scale, and you can potentially have lots of market participants. But it is not like the U.S. Treasury market, which is almost like a market for the whole world. And this is something that I guess was not mentioned last night, so I'll mention it here. When foreign investors come into a country like China, and they start buying the bonds of that country. Now, obviously, when you buy bonds, the two primary considerations are the yield, how much are you getting, and also the credit risk, absolutely, okay? There is something else that, very good, is the FX. Okay, now this is the part that was not mentioned last night. Liquidity, all of these things. But what I meant, now these are the risks, okay? What I meant was when investors decide to rush into a particular market and start buying the bonds of that market, apart from US Treasury, which everyone buys because it's the largest and it's the deepest and it's the most liquid. Apart from that one, when foreign investors go into a particular market and start buying bonds, the currency factor usually plays a part. And what I mean by that is, if investors believe that the currency of that country is going to appreciate. Now, if you want to be a fixed income sales in the future, this is a point worth keeping in mind. When foreign investors go into a country and they start looking at the bonds to buy, apart from the yield, which is important, apart from the credit risk you are taking and the liquidity, they are important. One very, very important consideration is the currency effect. Do they think that the currency of that country is likely to appreciate in the future? Are you with me? Which is why a few years ago, when the Chinese bond market was not really that open at the time, but there were people all over the world wishing to buy. And when they couldn't, they were happy even to buy dim sum bonds, which are renminbi bonds issued outside of China, but in renminbi. Now, right now, you know, different people would have different outlooks on the renminbi, but I haven't heard market commentators thinking that the renminbi is about to strengthen massively. I haven't heard that, and I think it's unlikely to happen. So I think that kind of makes it a little bit harder to sell Chinese fixed income to foreign investors in that from that angle. Okay. Will they devalue? I didn't say devalue. Well, I didn't. Do I see appreciation? What does it matter what I think? I don't have a clue. Well, these things are tricky. You know why? Because if you ask someone about the outlook of the renminbi, FX is tricky. you ask someone about the outlook of yen, Japanese yen, for example. Japanese yen is not just affected by domestic economic considerations in Japan. The dollar-yen exchange rate is affected by Japan as much as by the United States, so it's all relative. Okay? So it is quite hard. Now, but anyway, this bullet point, I want to just kind of share with you a little bit. Is it actually good to have a high degree of foreign ownership of domestic fixed income? Now, I remember there were some statistics being thrown around that I just want to share these things with you because they are good, market commentary. So the percentage, and Jasmine and Ziyun would know better than me because you guys did this, but I remember there was a table somewhere. Here we go. Now, look at the US market, 30%, Japan 10, Indonesia 40, Philippines 31, South Korea 12, so on. China 3. So you can imagine the amount, the potential. But back to my question, is it good to have foreign ownership of domestic fixed income? What do you think? It is good in a way. Now, it is good, as Yifan said, because it is an alternate avenue for you to get financing. I think the problem with this, as with a lot of things in life, is that too much of a good thing becomes bad for you. Even if you drink too much water, it can kill you. Right? And what I mean by that, and you see that quite often in emerging markets. In emerging markets, if you look at, so if this is the timeline, and these are fund inflow, let's say. So the emerging markets are funny. So either everyone is in emerging markets or everyone is out of emerging markets. You see, you understand the problem? Either a lot of money is coming in, they call it hot money, or suddenly everyone is out when there is a crisis. And that kind of nearly happened near the end of last year. And if you replace that, so instead of talking about fund flows, you talk about volatility, you get something similar, either very, very volatile or very, very boring. Now, emerging market governments don't like that. No one would like it. China certainly doesn't like it. Okay? They don't like it. They don't like excessive volatility, I guess. They don't like it when suddenly everyone is in emerging markets, but they don't like it here either. I think we are kind of here right now. But before, there was a time when we were here, when everyone wants to go into emerging markets. Now, when that happens, and this is sometimes called hot money, you've probably heard this term before, when a lot of hot money enters into a particular country, the end result is you have a lot of asset inflation. It looks good. It looks like everyone is having a party, but in the end, your economy gets overheated. You have a lot of asset inflation, which then becomes consumer inflation. And countries don't like it. Now, I want to mention this because it is all related to things that you have learned. Okay, so how do governments try to cope with that? How do they try to stop the fund inflow when you are in this kind of situation? You are on the right track. I'll give you a clue. Starts with W. Withholding tax. Now that's when that comes in. So governments typically, when they see a lot of speculative hot money fund inflow into a country, I'll give you some examples. Brazil. Give you another example. Thailand, I think. Okay. Japan, I don't think Japan, I'm not sure about Japan. So a few years ago, when things were going well, going too well, so countries like Brazil said, all right, from now on, any interest that you are paying to foreign investors, I'm going to slap on a 10%, 20% withholding tax. So that means if you are paying an 8% coupon, suddenly, maybe if you are the investor and you were receiving 8%, if there is a 20% tax, so you only get to retain, that's why it's called withholding. So they withhold 20%. So suddenly your coupon becomes 6.4. Are you with me? It makes it less attractive. Now the problem is if you bought a bond last year thinking that you receive an 8% coupon, and suddenly the issuer says, well, I'm so sorry, but looks like part of your money, in fact, 1.6%, is going to go directly into the government's tax account. Investors will be very, very unhappy, right? So what is the solution of that? This is when a tax call comes in. You remember that? So when there is a coupon reduction, and if it is caused by any of these events that you cannot foresee, so the issuer said, look, everyone is unhappy, let's just call it a day. I'll call the bond back and I'll just give you back your par value. Does that make more sense to you now? Yeah? You know what I'm saying? So all of that is tied together. Now, even if you didn't learn that in capital markets, it's not too late, okay? I'm really just repeating what you have learned, but I put a context to it, and I put a context to it because of this presentation really made me think about that. Okay? Okay? Does that make sense to you? Now, I want to also do you now all understand the difference between a pledged repo, which is a unique feature of the China repo market, and a rehypothecated repo? Do you all understand that? If you don't, I am happy to explain it. If you do, I don't want to waste your time. Now, the pledged repo, as of now, is a practice that you see in China. Now, what is a pledged repo? A pledged repo is like this. So you got party A. Party A has a bond, and party A sells that bond to party B, and party B will lend the money, maybe not the entire amount, but never mind, okay? And then I always like to put sell in inverted quotes because they're not really selling. Now, two things come out of this. Number one is that if party A ever goes bankrupt, now in China, okay, if party A ever goes bankrupt, there is nothing that party B can do, you actually have to return the bond back and then claim your $100. Now, this is, I guess it has a lot to do with that netting problem that I was telling you about. But in this instance, they can't just seize the asset and say, all right, you don't give my money back, I don't give you back your bond. You can't do it. That's number one. Okay. Number two, party B cannot on-sell this bond. When I say sell, it is again, so they cannot re-repo, if you like. Exactly. They cannot re-collateralize to somebody else. Now, this part is what's known as rehypothecation. What a long word. Rehypothecation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that idea of being able to create a chain of repo relationships, so B sell to C to D to E to F, is what makes the repo market so dynamic, at least in international financial markets. Now, it is possible, and I have seen it, you have a chain of so B, C, D, E, F, G. If one of them ever got in trouble, it's like a train. The whole thing comes to a standstill, and I suspect that is what the Chinese authorities are afraid of. Maybe. Okay? But whatever the reasons, you can't do that yet in China. Maybe in the future you can. Right now you can't. Are you okay with that? Yeah. So that is the difference between a pledge repo and a rehypothecated repo. So that is kind of, so this is in China, domestic. So this is basically international standard practice. So if you repo a bond from me for 1 month, within that month, I'm free to do whatever I want with it, as long as I give it back to you at the end of the month. Okay? Everyone is okay with that? Yeah? Okay, that's good. Now, I want to just talk a bit about leverage ratios, because this seems to be causing some confusion, and I could sense that just hearing some of your questions last night. And I'm not really surprised, because I think the regulators, especially Basel III, they've done a fantastic job confusing people. Then we come to this from two different angles. And the first angle is what I call leverage ratio in a Basel sense versus leverage ratio in the accounting sense. And the second angle is leverage ratio in a Basel sense versus leverage ratio actual. Okay, now, before I do that, I want to just clear up a lot of the confusion here. You might remember in lecture 1, Ryan mentioned something about non-risk weighted capital ratios. Now, I don't know if any of you caught that, his remark, but he did make a mention, non-risk weighted capital ratio. Now, what does that even mean? You have to kind of go back a bit and understand the history behind the bank regulation framework. And you go back like 20 years, 25, 30 years. And at the time, regulators, they realize that if you have two banks, Bank A and Bank B, and let's say the size of their balance sheet are the same. So they're both, I don't know, maybe $100 billion. Now the size, the size, okay? $100 billion on the asset side. Let's just say 100 billion, it doesn't matter. They're both 100 billion. So even like 30, 40 years ago, regulators already recognized that if Bank A has very good assets, AAA, AA, but Bank B has like, you know, double B or triple B or double B or even single B, you can't just compare the size of the balance sheet and determine their risks. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So now that is the genesis. So I guess 30, 40 years ago, regulators didn't even try. And they were not looking at absolute sizes of balance sheet for a long, long time, but instead they have these so-called risk weights. So if you are AA or AAA or AA, so your risk weights will be very small. So maybe you can adjust your 100 billion by a smaller risk weight. So your risk-weighted assets becomes like 20 billion. Whereas for the other bank, if your risk weights were, let's say 50%, let's just say 50, then your risk-weighted assets would be 50 billion. And from there, from that simple idea, they would say, all right, well, these are your risk-weighted assets, and whatever tier one capital you have, I want it to be more than 4%. You're all okay with that? Yeah? All bankers need to understand this. Everyone is okay? Now, I'm really just recapping on things that now you know so well. However, I think since the global financial crisis 10, 11 years ago, bankers realized, they've kind of come full circle now, the regulators, they realized, yeah, well, maybe we should look at the balance sheet size. You know what I'm saying? Maybe we shouldn't just look at credit risk adjusted ratios. Maybe we should look at the absolute size of the balance sheet. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, isn't that common sense? I tell you, for a long time, no one bothered. Up until 2008, no one bothered. So it's really only in the last 10 years or so, and that was actually, I think, an initiative, bless you, started by the Bank of England. So they were the first ones to start that. Now, then they started this concept called leverage ratio. Now, what the hell is that? Leverage ratio. First of all, if you have a balance sheet, okay, and if you call this X, if you call this Y, if you call this Z, if you ask an accountant or an equity analyst or an equity analyst, yes, they will either reply the leverage ratio is either Y over Z or maybe X over Z, or depending on who you talk to. Now, that is why I said the Basel guys, They really managed to confuse everyone. According to Basel, the leverage ratio is defined as Z over Y. Oh, sorry, over X. I beg your pardon. Now, hold on a second. Yeah, this is correct. This is Z. Are you with me? Huh? I'm saying that if you ask an accountant, what is your understanding of leverage ratio? You know, in a corporate context, they will tell you it is either your debt over your equity. Look, let's just use more sensible alphabets. Assets, debt, equity. How about that? The leverage ratio, you ask an accountant, they will tell you it is either your debt over your equity or maybe your asset over equity. You can look that up. But my point is, when you ask Basel, they turn the whole thing upside down. According to Basel, leverage ratio is equity over assets. Are you with me there? So from a safety point of view, if you ask an accountant, the lower this number, the safer a bank is. But if you ask the Basel guys, they want this number to be as high as possible, don't they? Yeah? Now, so I'm not surprised people get confused. Now, so here when I said leverage ratio Basel versus leverage ratio accounting, that is what I meant. So you ask different people, they give you different versions. That's the first thing. Is everyone okay with that? Now, I want to get on to the second point. So leverage ratio Basel versus leverage ratio actual. Now, what do I mean? Now, the problem is that apart from coming up with this definition, according to Basel, there are some transactions that are not captured. For example, certain derivatives or certain off-balance sheet items. So they might be sort of hiding here. And TRS is one such example. So if your bank has a balance sheet that looks like this, the solid line, but you do a lot of TRSs, so you have a lot of credit exposure, and you have a lot of LIBOR funding, they are not going to show up. In other words, your total exposure, it should be, let's say, A dash. It is not. It is only A. And I think that's why yesterday you were a little bit confused. The actual leverage, if you want, the actual, in this case, would indeed be E over A dash. So I think that's why you thought you were a bit confused. But because certain products, and TRS is one such example, there are others, the exposure that you created is not included in your total, on the asset side. So according to Basel, your leverage ratio would just be E over A. Are you with me? Do you now understand? Correct. They did not take that into account. That was the whole point that Ryan was trying to get through to you guys. Well, when I say actual, what I mean is your real exposure. Now, think of it like this. Okay, don't think about this. So you have $100, okay, in cash. So your assets are $100 and then your equity is $100. And suddenly you go out there and you decided to buy a futures contract. You go long, okay? And let's say the futures contract, also the contract value is 100. Now, technically, it does not appear in your balance sheet. It's just a futures contract, but your actual exposure, let's just say your economic, okay, we use that word so many times, but your economic exposure is now this, is it not? That's what leverage is all about. So I'm just trying to distinguish leverage ratio according to Basel and the strange way they work and how they count some things and don't count some other things. I'm trying to compare that with the actual economic exposure that you may have. And here, you really do have leverage in the technical economic sense of the word. And I think that's where there was a confusion. Am I right? Are you okay now? Yeah. You sure? Go ahead. Yeah. What product? Which side would this bank be on? It depends on what the motive is. Now, okay, so he's asking me for a bank, which side of the transaction will they be in a TRS? Now, let me give you a scenario, a kind of imaginary scenario. I am Pudong Development Bank, Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, and I have a portfolio, and I have some bonds here on my asset side, real bonds. Maybe I have some bonds of Alibaba, doesn't matter who. And this is my equity. So my balance sheet is $100 billion or renminbi, but I have some bonds here. Let's say I have doesn't matter, $5 billion worth of bonds with Alibaba. Now, because I have these bonds really sitting on my balance sheet, they're going to cost me because I need a little bit of capital allocated from my equity base in order to back up this transaction. That's how banks work. What I would like to do is I want to get rid of this exposure. So if I sell the bonds and I get money and I pay back the borrowing So I shrink my balance sheet. It's called deleveraging. So now the end result is my equity is unchanged, but this capital is now freed up. I can now use this to do something else. Now the word for that sometimes, and Ryan has used that a few times, I call it capital relief. I'm relieving the capital for some other purpose, but I've now sold the bonds, but guess what? I actually like Alibaba. I like those bonds. I like that credit risk. So what can I do? Well, it turns out there is something you can do. I do a TRS. So I am Shanghai Pudong Development Bank. I enter into a contract, let's just say with JP Morgan, let's just say JP Morgan. I enter into a TRS with JP Morgan where I pay LIBOR and then I get the performance of these bonds, whether the price goes up or down. I get the performance. And guess what? This is not going to count as exposure on my balance sheet. So I have achieved the two purposes at the same time, which is I reduce my leverage, except that you haven't. But I have satisfied the Basel people, I have reduced my leverage, and at the same time, I get to keep the exposure that I like. Have I answered your question, Wado? You think? Yeah? This is a very common scenario. Yeah, that's what Ryan was trying to tell you guys. Yeah. Correct. If the performance, there's nobody saying that the performance must be positive. Now, performance includes all the performance. That's my performance. So, if it is, so it includes all the coupons and this and that, but if they are ever in trouble, yes, your bond price can go substantially below 100. Then you have to pay them, yes. Yeah. Hmm. I see what you mean. Yeah, because you are short the asset. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But you don't need to think too hard about that part. Okay. This is a very, very typical scenario of what can actually happen. Now, so just to, all right, so you all know very well that according to Basel I and Basel II and so on, so Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital has to be more than, Tier 1 capital has to be more than 4%, Tier 1 plus Tier 2 has to be more than 8%, but that was a long time ago. Nowadays, with most banks, even Tier 1 as a percentage of risk-weighted asset is usually in excess of 10. If you care to look around any major bank. Now, that is the capital adequacy. What about leverage ratio? Now, I want to share some information with you. And sometimes it is quite alarming for me. Now, you know how in Hong Kong, for example, if you want to buy an apartment, let's say $10 million, you are required to come up with at least $3 million of your own money. I'm talking about mortgages, Is that so? Okay, I'll take, yeah. 5 is even more conservative, but let's just say 3. Now, what is my leverage ratio in this case, according to Basel? It is actually 3/10. It's very, very healthy. It's absolutely rock solid, 30%. And I said to you earlier that the higher this number, the higher the safety. So those Basel guys, they really turned everything upside down. Can you make a guess when it comes to banks? So now we look at the absolute size of their balance sheet. So you've got assets, regardless of credit quality, okay? So we're not concerned with that, but there's equity and debt. When I say equity, I mean tier one, real, like stocks, common equity. Can you make a guess as to what is the typical leverage ratio of big banks? And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. I want to show you HSBC, and I want to show you Barclays. Do you have any idea what that number might be? 10%? No, 10% is the capital adequacy ratio that I mentioned. So that one is risk adjusted. So if it is risk adjusted, your asset side will become more compressed. But without any risk adjustments, you purely just look at the assets, the dollar amount. Never mind you are AAA, BBB, CCC, just the actual dollar amount, the full picture, without the derivatives, as we said. Now I will show you. So I have here an example with, this is HSBC, and they call that Pillar 3 disclosure. And to be honest, I find that a little bit frightening, the amount of leverage that banks have. Can you see that? What does that number say? 5.6%. So if you measure the size of HSBC's balance sheet without taking into account whether they are AAA assets, BBB, CCC, whatever, if the assets were, let's say $1 trillion, it's probably bigger than that. Let's just say 1 trillion. HSBC is much bigger than that. So your equity would only be how much? 56 billion. Now 56 billion sounds like a lot of money for me. Until you compare it with a number like this. What does it really mean? Your leverage ratio is 5.6. It means if the value of your assets were to decrease by just a little under 6%, you have wiped out your equity. And this is without counting some of the derivatives, as we said earlier. Remember? Things like TRS are not included there. So we look at Barclays. Now, the reason I picked Barclays was actually in a bit of trouble a few years ago. They are much better now, but there was a time when the leverage ratio of Barclays was around 3%, or maybe 3.5%. And even now, there are a lot of different measures. This is the latest one, September 2018. Whichever way you look at it, I don't know, there are different ways to measure it. But I'll be generous, I'll take 4.9. So they are 20 times leverage. That gives you an idea. Yeah. Regarding Basel, it's a good point. And you know, Wikipedia has an article for every emergency, and leverage ratio is no different. And I want to show you. I saw something. Because they made a mention of exactly the point that you made just now. Leverage ratio A. Okay. I know. So if you look at Basel III, and within Basel III, there is an entry on leverage ratio. I am actually responding to your point, the point you just made now, the point you made just now. Now, it is true that Basel introduced a minimum leverage ratio. Now, this is non-risk based. That's precisely what Ryan was trying to tell you. It's non-credit risk related. So it is blind to whether you are holding AAA, triple B, triple C. I don't care. I just want to know the size of your balance sheet, except that I'm not counting the derivatives or some of the derivatives. Okay. And it's calculated by dividing Tier 1 capital by the bank's average total consolidated assets. The banks are expected to maintain a leverage ratio in excess of 3%. Personally, I think that's too low. And the US Fed seems to agree. Because in July, and that's in response to the point, in July 2013, the US Fed announced the minimum Basel III leverage ratio would be 6% for 8 systematically important financial institutions and 5% for their insured bank holding companies. So on both counts, Barclays would actually fail that test. And HSBC only just made the mark because what were they? 5.6. Yeah. So you get an idea of what's really going on. I thought, you know, apart from just telling you leverage ratio, I want to show you some numbers so you can relate to it. Is everyone okay? Yes. They don't because it's the fact. So the way it works, like, you know, these frameworks, there's a global committee with representatives from central banks all over the world, and they meet regularly, and they agree on a common philosophy in Basel. But when they go back to their own country, it's up to them what adjustments they want to make. So in the US Fed, in their case, they obviously want a higher number. And, you know, Barclays, they have a hard time. They have a hard enough time from the Bank of England. So that would be the one, you know, looking over their shoulders. What else I want to show you? I actually have some notes. This is a long question. I have some notes regarding ISDA, so I think now you know why I was so keen to share with you, elements of ISDA, because I knew it would come up, not only for this course, it's going to come up in a few months when you guys start working. Doesn't matter if it's the buy side or sell side, it's going to hit you. Okay? So if you remember the key elements of an ISDA contract, the master, the schedule, the definitions, and Ryan mentioned that last night. He mentioned the credit derivative definitions, which I think I showed you earlier. Right? The deal confirmation and the famous CSA, which he also mentioned. This is kind of like margin trading, and I think most of you get that now. It's like topping up your margin account. I actually have I call it ISDA CSA Remastered. I have a simple example here of two banks trading. So let's say you are trading, so it's all coming back to you, I hope. The threshold amount and the minimum transfer, but now you really can apply this in a more sort of commercial setting, because when you are trading TRS, this becomes supremely relevant, and you got two parties trading the performance of a particular bond, and so when you are buying a bond, of course you are long the credit risk. When you are selling protection on a credit default swap, you are also long credit risk. When you are buying TRS risk, when you are buying the performance, when you are buying the return, you are also long credit risk. But if you are on the other side, to other as you mentioned, if you are not taking the return, but you are providing, yes, you are on the other side of the balance sheet, if you are short credit risk. So when you do all this, I have a very simple example here. So initial margin, you use payback, and then you have a CSA, the threshold, and the minimum transfer amount, exactly as we discussed in capital markets, and a very, very simple sort of day-to-day market-to-market funds transfer. If you were with me in capital markets during the last couple of tutorials, you will not have a problem understanding this. So this is just to consolidate and to refresh your memory. There was one thing which I want to just share with you in the last few minutes. You all know what a margin call is. And I want to just talk a little bit about, gap risk. Are you familiar with that term? Gap risk? Now, gap risk refers to when the market, so this is time, so when the market is kind of trading like this, and then suddenly one day it just falls. And that is what people commonly refer to as gap risk. It's the risk of the price falling so fast that you don't even have time to call your client and ask them to make a margin call. And you don't even have time to liquidate their position because prices have fallen so fast. And I thought it's worth mentioning that because now, of course, this happens in the equity market. That's what crashing is all about. Markets crash. It happens in equity. It can happen in commodities. It probably happens less with currencies, although it can, but not as common. But it can happen in fixed income. The Soviet Union. Or the euro. The reason I said it's a bit more difficult with the currency, well, I guess it depends on what currency you have in mind. If it's just some, 5 million people republic in the middle of Africa, of course you can. But if you're talking like the euro or the yen, or the renminbi, these big markets, it is not that easy to move a big market like the currency market. But in bonds, it can happen. And the reason I said, okay, it can happen in equity, yes it can. It can happen in commodities. Sometimes prices just go boom, like someone doing an Olympic dive in the pool. But in fixed income, there is something unique that you don't find in the other asset classes. Okay? Now, so what is the point about ISDA? You know all that. This slide is recycled. What is the point about the CSA is that when the other party is losing, so constantly they have to put money into your account. That is a point. However, why do we care so much? We worry that the other party loses so much money, they're just going to disappear. And they can no longer function as a company, especially after the global financial crisis. Now, my point here about gap risk is I see something unique about credit as an asset class that, think about it, you don't really see with equity, and you don't really see it with commodities or FX. And that is, there is something kind of binary or digital about credit, because the company can be functioning and one of my favorite sayings, everything is okay until it's not okay. That's fixed income, isn't it? Yeah? So until a company actually officially announced, oh, we are defaulting, until they default, they haven't defaulted. So the binary nature of credit, I think, makes it especially prone to gap risk. So one day you might be okay, suddenly the next day you come on, oh shit, we defaulted. And then the bonds can drop like 30% or something. I've seen that happening. And so I wanted to mention the concept of gap risk, which now I have explained to you. I want to mention this idea and just in the hope that you can relate that to, the credit market. Because the credit market really can, sometimes it's orderly, but typically it is not. Typically they try to survive for something, oh shit, we can't handle this. Okay, like this. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I mean by gap risk. The risk of something happening suddenly so quickly that you just cannot possibly prepare for it. Well, it's not exactly that. Maybe you have, it is one thing to say that you have considered, but it is another thing to really prepare for it. I'll give you an example. if 10 years ago you were the risk officer of I don't know, the Fed, let's say, the US Fed, and somebody asked you in the summer of 2008, what is the probability of Lehman Brothers going bankrupt? Now, you might say, I don't know, 1%, 2%, it's just a number. 1%, 2% suddenly, and I really mean suddenly, becomes 30%, which then becomes 100%, because that's how it happened. Oh, Black Swan, yeah, the Black Swan. Exactly that. So the gap risk is the risk of markets moving so fast that you don't have time to call your client for margin call. You don't even have time to liquidate their positions. And I think, in a fixed income asset class, in a credit asset class, the personality of this asset class, I think, is quite different from the other ones, because there is this, definitive event known as defaulting, which you don't find in equity. Okay? I think I've taken enough of your time. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope that was interesting. There's actually something else I wanted to show you, but I won't today. It's regarding, now, strictly speaking, this is kind of fixed income, but you can go home and read that if you want. Is anyone doing fixed income here? Yeah? Do they talk about parallel shifts and yield curve steepening? Okay. Now, somebody asked me this question. You can go home and read it. The slides are there. Somebody asked me this question, and that got me thinking, some macro observations. So I actually produced some slides, which I'm happy to talk about next time if we have time. But I'm trying to describe what happens to a bond market and the different types of yield curve movements. Parallel move, what is a bull flattening? You see that quite often in analyst reports and financial press. What is bull flattening? What is bear flattening? What is bull steepening? What is bear steepening? So feel free to read that, or if we have time next time, I'll try and go through it. Okay? All right, it's late, so go home. Thank you for listening. Have a very nice evening.